Thank you very much. Before I begin, I would like to extend thanks to a number of organizations and individuals who've been instrumental in supporting my research. First and foremost, the co-sponsor with the School of Continuing Studies for this course, the Rice Historical Society, a group of Rice alumni and friends who are dedicated to preserving and making known the history of Rice University and having a good time doing it. So if you're not a member, I encourage you to join that group of people. Professor John B. Bowles, whom you have heard from, William P. Hobby, Professor of History at Rice University and the historian of Rice University. Two people who have been especially dedicated to preserving the architectural history of the university. Ray Watkins Strange, the daughter of William Ward Watkin, the first professor of architecture, and Drexel Turner. And last, but by no means least, the Woodson Research Center, the archives of Fondren Library, which is the great repository for both the documentary and illustrative history of Rice University. I noticed in the last lecture I attended here, the last continuing studies lecture, that sometimes the slides are not totally in focus, and I'm looking from a slightly weird perspective, so I can't always tell. If they're really annoyingly out of focus, please speak up and let me know, and I'll try and fix that. The campus of Rice University is widely admired for its spatial and architectural coherence. Given the unpromising setting that confronted Rice's first president, Edgar Odell Lovett, and his architect, Ralph Adams Cram of Boston, when they began to plan the university's campus in 1909, its coherence stands out as the more extraordinary. That the campus is in Houston, a city notorious for its aversion to planning, elevates Rice to the category of the near miraculous. As an architectural historian, I am fascinated by the ways in which the president and his architect constructed an ideal landscape for the Rice Institute. The exotic neo-Byzantine architectural style that Ralph Adams Cram formulated for the buildings that his firm, Cram, Goodhue and Ferguson, designed at Rice, has always attracted critical recognition. So much so that the issue of Rice's style is often detached from the broader context of architectural design, which involves site planning, interior planning, orientation, and environmental responsiveness. When examined in this broader context, Cram's stylistic excursions seem less eccentric. Analyzing the ways that Cram constructed Rice architecturally, and I use this word construct the way anthropologists would to describe social construction as well as the process of building buildings, one realizes that he was not simply providing certain types of spaces for certain types of activities, but giving shape to a vision of community that he shared with President Lovett. Because there was no existing community, no Rice Institute, in 1909 through 1912, when the campus plan and the first buildings were designed and built, Cram and Lovett had to construct it first in their imaginations. The general plan of 1910 and Cram's buildings spatialize, so to speak, the community they envision. Their vision, their social construction of Rice as a university dedicated to what President Lovett called high emprise, has persisted. In looking at the architectural development of the general plan during Rice's first century, it is intriguing to see how succeeding generations have responded to Cram and Lovett's spatial legacy. Cram's plan began with the landscape setting, which offered little except limitless flatness. Aerial views of the 1920s. Herman Park, here on the left, looking to the open coastal plain south of Brays Bayou, and Rice to the right, illustrate the magnitude of the landscape's featurelessness. As an aerial view of the academic court from the 1930s demonstrates, with the administration building, the physics building, and Tony Martino's Rose Garden. What Cram, Goodhue, and Ferguson did in response was to make what reads from the air as lines in the landscape. On the ground, however, these lines are experienced as spaces, as palpable volumes that focus perception, direct movement, and frame vistas. Cram, Goodhue, and Ferguson constructed a spatial armature with landscape. They imposed a new spatial architecture on the campus site that was made up in part of buildings, but because of the scale of the landscape, relied upon massed plantings to shape space over distances that buildings alone could not control. When one considers that it was not until 30 or more years after Rice opened in 1912 that this spatial structure, literally this landscape architecture, began to achieve maturity, one appreciates the extraordinary foresight and determination of Ralph Adams Cram and Edgar Odell Lovett. In shaping space, Cram and Lovett also constructed meaning. Specifying the meanings to be deduced from the experience of the campus and its architecture is a bit tricky. Cram did not leave program notes except to justify his choice of a Byzantine architectural style. But experiencing the campus leads one to conclusions about how it makes one feel. For instance, the entry sequence. It begins at entrance 1 on Main Boulevard. As you are aware, the gateway screen is not perpendicular to Main. Instead, it is laid out in an arc, and as you enter the campus, you are shifted off the axis of Main Street, profane Houston, and onto the main axis of Cram's general plan, the ideal world inside the hedges. Note that there are hedges arrayed in front of the entrance gate. Note how they fill up vacant space, giving definite shape to the emptiness, and create a new horizontal datum about waist high that produces an upper layer of landscape, relieving the planarity and emptiness of the site in its natural condition. Notice, and here on the right I've switched to the piers at entrance 2 because they aren't covered with fig ivy, that the gate piers are constructed of salmon-colored Buffalo Bayou brick and founded on a base course of pink Texas granite. Although they are detailed with oversized brick bands laid up with thick mortar joints, attributes of medieval Byzantine brick construction, the brick and stone are local, or at least Texan in origin. Cram incorporated the colors and materials of the indigenous landscape in his Rice architecture to naturalize his exotic stylistic references. You may have noted that the main gates bear limestone shields with the insignia of the Rice Institute. Cram's heraldry consultant, Pierre Chagnon-Larose, researched the armorial bearings of families named Houston and Rice to construct a coat of arms that combined Athena's owl with coded assertions of civic identity. Spatially, the gate piers mark a threshold. They are literally landmarks and reorient new arrivals. In terms of landscape, they began to fill up the emptiness. Materially, they reconcile potentially contradictory assertions of exotic and indigenous identity. Symbolically, they allied the pursuit of wisdom with civic honor. The gateways demonstrate how Cram, Goodhue, and Ferguson materialized meanings which, if made explicit, would perhaps seem too obviously fictitious. The mechanism the architects employed to prevent critical disillusionment was beauty. The more seamlessly beautiful the spatial experience they constructed, the more irresistible the internalization of the meanings built into them became. Well, the gateway is simply the threshold. One way Cram imposed measure and rhythm on the featureless landscape was by inscribing thresholds to mark spatial intervals, the way that natural formations, especially hills and mountains in a mountainous landscape, mark deep visual perspectives and big-scale spatial intervals. The approach to the administration building demonstrates how Cram choreographed movement through space, using nature to compensate for the lack of spatial intervals in the site's natural condition. This sector of the campus was one of the few places where there were trees, dotted just to the left of the present entrance drive. Cram, Goodhue, and Ferguson amplified the grove with double rows of live oak trees framing the road and a pair of flanking sidewalks. Once the trees grew to maturity, they canopied the entrance drive to tightly frame a distant view of the sally port of the administration building. The trees form a tunnel of space, directing movement and insistently focusing one's vision. Only at the end of this drive does the administration building emerge in full. At this point, there is a greensward installed in 1960. Cram installed a graveled forecourt that was rapidly claimed as a spatial amenity he hadn't foreseen the need for, a parking lot. Here the landscape reverts to the planar flatness and openness of its aboriginal condition in order to frame the full 300-foot expanse of the administration building. Cram choreographed movement and perception to enforce the sense of awe and amazement with which the administration building, in its Byzantine splendor, was meant to impress new arrivals to the university. He masterfully used the landscape to frame this building and enhance its stature and presence, constructing it spatially and socially as a cultural powerhouse. Here I think one begins to see clearly how Cram, Goodhue, and Ferguson purposefully used lines in the landscape to direct movement and frame views that were not only perceptual but ideological. Yet they constructed space with such subtlety and skill that one feels awed rather than manipulated. The present greensward moves the approaching motorist off-axis. The pedestrian was already sidelined since the street occupies the center line of the axis. As one moves closer toward the administration building, one becomes aware of how the architects used light and shadow to enhance the building's presence. Because it is very long, but very thin, it's only 50 feet wide, the administration building could easily seem attenuated rather than imposing. Cram, Goodhue, and Ferguson gave it a sense of depth by opening spatial voids in the building. The loggias of what was originally the faculty chamber. There we are. Of the faculty chamber. Here is the big loggia, of course, mirrored on the other side by a loggia where the library was originally located. Produce wells of shadow that give the administration building the visual solidity it needs to prevent it from appearing too thin. In the sally port, the main axis is reasserted and breaks through to daylight, revealing the full thickness of the building. In the sally port, one regains the axis. Here, Cram inscribed another threshold. The open ground plane of the forecourt contracts. Space is squeezed upward. Through the arch of the sally port, which feels quite monumental, Cram framed a vista of the sky that preserves the feeling of immensity he remarked on when he was first shown the campus site in September 1909. Cram used architecture to powerfully communicate the scale of the landscape and suggest implicitly that the administration building is a powerhouse capable of projecting its spatial order to encompass earth and sky. In addition to its operation at the scale of the landscape, the administration building introduces a new, finer layer of spatial organization that operates at the scale of a building. In the Sallyport, Cram offers alternate routes. One can either proceed on axis directly into the academic court, or be diverted off axis into the arcaded cloisters on the west face of the building. The cloisters demonstrate that Cram, Goodhue, and Ferguson consistently use space as their primary architectural medium. As one walks from the Sallyport into the cloister, a closed bay, it's this one that's in shadow here, with an apsidal wall toward the academic court. There's sort of a curved wall that seals it off from the view of the academic court, and a domical vault, that sort of curvilinear geometry is repeated in the ceiling of that bay, spatially announces the entrance to the library. Today it's the entrance to the president's office. The acoustics in this bay differ from those in the Sallyport, underscoring its exceptional status. Beyond it, the cloister run continues, each bay sealed with a tiled vault. Cram, Goodhue, and Ferguson spatialized linear movement, yet simultaneously they spatialized the sense that each bay of the cloister is a distinct place. They underscored this distinction with sculptural iconography. The most memorable of the cloister column capitals are those that show the weenie, the jock, and the cheerleader of the 1912 era. This humorous iconography, along with the sculptural tributes to the great men of learning and animal symbols of knowledge and wisdom, construct a composite Rice collegiate identity that is ritually transferred during O-Week freshman orientation. Especially with these jokey details, one sees how Cram and Lovett constructed community in their design of the campus. They embedded buildings with symbols that could be integrated into rituals of campus life and ultimately of Rice identity. In analyzing the ways that Cram used architecture and landscape to socially as well as spatially construct place, it is impressive to see how Cram, Goodhue, and Ferguson kept coming up with different ways to do the same thing. This attribute, constructing unity with variety, means that their architecture never seems mechanical, repetitious, or monotonous. It enabled them to commit redundancy, to reinforce an architectural idea by reproducing it over and over again without becoming dull. One example is their provision of parallel routes of circulation. The cloisters in the administration building connect to the cloisters of the physics building, completed in 1914. Here, of course, the physics building next door to the administration building. The cloisters, and here you see the cloisters of the physics building, enabled the architects to fill up the emptiness of the campus site by creating multiple layers of space. The cloisters also contributed to the spatial identity of their host buildings. Note that the proportions of the physics building cloister are more vertical than those of the academic building cloister, the administration building cloister, and that the physics building cloister has a flat ceiling rather than a vaulted ceiling. Again, here the administration building cloister, quite different proportion, and especially a different ceiling space compared to the physics building. Both have cloisters, but each, and they're both continuous with each other, but each has its own distinct identity. Imbuing spaces with nuances that differentiated them, even when they were directly linked, demonstrates how Cram, Goodhue, and Ferguson constructed unity with variety. Layering space was a technique used to link the landscape and the architecture. The academic court, the campus landscape that most nearly preserves Cram, Goodhue, and Ferguson's original design, although simplified in 1960 and again in 1980, shows how they integrated buildings and plantings to project a spatial order that asserted power over the visual monotony of the original landscape.